We are in part 17 of our study in Revelation. So you're troopers. You made it this far. We've got a few more parts to go before we get to the end of the book. And so tonight we're in Revelation chapter 14. So if you've got a Bible, you can turn to Revelation 14. We're going to try to cover the whole chapter. So I'm probably going to move a little bit fast, and we'll dig into that in a minute. Now, what we're doing is we're finishing the last section of what we call the interlude. So if you've been with us lately, we're in this section here where there's a break and there's 7 different things that John sees and describes for us. So we're in we're going to cover the last 3 of those. So the last several weeks we've been covering the first 4. And last week we talked about the beast and all that kind of stuff. So what we're going to read in this section is he's going to see the 144,000. Remember them? The 144,000, right? They were in chapter 7. So they're going to come up again in this passage, but there's something different about that group this time. And we'll talk about that in a second. We're also going to see 3 angels that have 3 messages. So they say, these 3 angels each say something. And we're going to take that and compare it to 3 other things we've already learned about. And then we're going to hear about the harvest of the land. So those are the 3 things. The lamb and the 144,000 are together. The 3 messages of the 3 angels, and the harvest of the land. And then at the end tonight, so in case you're watching this video online later, the homework that we have from last week, I told you to go find where the rapture is in Revelation. See if you can find it. So we're going to talk about that at the very end tonight. So if you're watching this video and you're halfway through and you're like, I really don't care about any of this, I'm quitting, we're going to talk about the rapture at the end a little bit. So we'll deal with that in a little while. So we'll see how far we get in this. But so anyway, so we're going to cover these 3 interludes that are found here in this section. Now, what this is also going to do is it's going to provide like a contrast. So the section we just finished in the last couple weeks talked about God's people being protected, and remember the whole woman who's going to flee into the wilderness, and that was a symbol of faithful Israel being protected for 3.5 years during this war that was going to be going on in Jerusalem. So we learned about that, and then that was in chapter 12. Chapter 13 tells us about the beast and how these people are going to follow and worship the beast and basically do whatever he tells them to do. And one of the big things they're going to do, if they're following the beast, is they're going to be killing the saints. Not all of them, but they're going to be killing a lot of the saints. So we talked about that last week. What we're about to read in chapter 14 is going to contrast from that. So it's going to talk about the good guys, the 144,000 who are with the Lamb, and then there's these 3 messages that John hears from 3 angels, and then the harvest of the land and all that stuff. So there's a bit of contrast between 12 and 13 and 14. So all this will make more sense as we kind of dig through it. Now, before we dig into the text, I want to just a quick review of one of the rules for reading Revelation. Now, you probably don't remember because it was 17 weeks ago. But in part 1, we talked about 5 rules for reading Revelation. And I'm not going to review all 5 of them, just one. And it doesn't have a lot to do with what we're going to study tonight, but I'm telling you now because it's going to matter in the next few weeks. And here's I want to call it a guiding principle, okay, for reading Revelation. Do not read Revelation for chronological order. What I mean by that is, if you're reading the book of Revelation as we have it today, and you're reading it, it kind of seems like these events are in order until you get to like an event like chapter 12, where he starts describing the birth of Jesus. So that tells you kind of these events aren't necessarily in chronological order. Okay, remember we're reading about John's visions. There's 4 main visions, and there's a bunch of stuff that happens in each of those 4. But we should not assume all these things are in the order that John is describing them. He's just saying, I saw this, and then I saw this, and after that I saw this. He's not saying, I saw this, which means directly after that, this is going to happen. What we're reading is apocalyptic literature, which means it's full of visions and he's seeing symbols and things that represent real things on earth. We should not assume all those things are in chronological order. They're clearly not. If you pay attention to how the book is laid out, it's not all in chronological order. The reason why I'm telling you that is because in the next few sessions, we're going to be dealing with things that people are going through great pains to put in chronological order, and it doesn't work. So I'm preparing you for that discussion now. Just reminding you, I told you this at the beginning, but I'm reminding you here as we move forward. Don't think everything is in chronological order, okay? Make sense? Okay, just want to make sure we got that in our head as we go through the coming weeks. All right, ready? All right, chapter 14. This is interlude number 5. Remember, we're in that section of 7, so we're in number 5 here. This one's, you might have a heading in your Bible, which is not in the original text. The translators have put that there just to help you, but it probably say something like the Lamb and the 144,000. If you read the English Standard Version, that's what it'll say. All right, verse 1. Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb. Now we know he doesn't mean a literal lamb, right? That's his title for Jesus. Okay, remember way back in chapter 5, he sees the lamb who was slain. He sees a bloody lamb, but it's alive, and it's in heaven, and it's able to open the scroll and all that kind of stuff. So it's clearly Jesus. That's one of his titles for Jesus. So on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. Okay, now if you remember back from chapter 7, we read about the 144,000 for the first time, and they were sealed or marked, meaning that's a symbol, it's a metaphor for they have been protected for God. They've been set apart for God. And we talked back then about how this was the Jewish believers who would be protected from the 3.5-year judgments that were coming on Jerusalem in the near future. Okay, now here we see them again, and these are clearly the same group, but we're going to find out there's something different. Back in chapter 7, these people were protected, they're still alive, and this chapter, something different's going on. So let's break apart what I've highlighted here, and then we'll keep moving through the passage. What in the world is Mount Zion? Okay, now a lot of people just assume that's Jerusalem, okay, but that's not always the case. This title is most often used in the Bible to describe God's dwelling place. Now we know that God had a dwelling place in Jerusalem at one time, but what have we learned since Jesus set foot on the earth? He walked around the temple and said, no, he ain't been here in a long time. This whole thing's coming down, right? Jesus was the new temple, and now we're the temple. Yeah? Okay, so what is Mount Zion? Well, it's the title for God's dwelling place, and sometimes in the Old Testament, it's the title for God's faithful people. It's a symbol of that. So in the Old Testament, Zion occurs 155 times, and it does not refer to a place of sin and judgment, which in Revelation, Jerusalem is a place of sin that is under judgment. So this Mount Zion here is not talking about Jerusalem, and this will make more sense in a minute as we keep reading the passage. So apparently there's a Mount Zion wherever God's dwelling place is, and the Lamb is there. We've already seen that all the way through Revelation, that the Lamb is with the Father, right? And these 144,000 are now with him. In this passage, we're going to see that Mount Zion is John's title for heaven's throne, the throne room of heaven. And that's where the Lamb is, and now the 144,000 are with him. So what does that mean about the 144,000 if they are now with Jesus in heaven? What do you have to do to get to heaven, folks? Die. Yes, they're dead. Okay? Now they were protected from the judgments on Jerusalem, but that didn't mean they would never die. I mean, they're still going to die, whether natural causes or whatever. So now these people have died, and they're standing with the Lamb. And this will make more sense as we go on. But what about this thing about their name, or the Lamb's name and the Father's name on their foreheads? Remember, that was the sealing. They were sealed. Now, a lot of modern writers that write popular books on Revelation, they make this literal, meaning these people like have his name tattooed across their forehead. But all throughout the Bible, this is symbolic language. I'll give you some examples of that. Remember the high priest? He had a literal title across his head, but it was on a crown, right? The high priest had a crown on his head, and across the top it said, "Holy to the Lord," "Holy to Yahweh," right? Kadosh Yahweh. So that was, but who's the high priest? He's a representative for the people of Israel. He represents Israel before God, and he represents God before Israel. That's what the high priest does. So that's a literal marking that was, on his head. But listen to this in Deuteronomy 11:18, and this is in your notes in our app. He says this. He's talking to Israel about his word and his law. He says, "You shall therefore lay up these words of mine in your heart and in your soul. And you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes," your forehead. Now, does he mean literally take the Torah, which was on stone tablets at the time, and strap them to your head? No. It's a symbol, it's a metaphor for this needs to control how you think. And you bind it to your hand, meaning this should control how you act. How you think, how you act needs to be governed by these words of mine, he says in Deuteronomy 11. And there's multiple scriptures that say that. I'm just picking one of the best examples. So this is a mark that means these people are sealed. They belong to God. You can't do nothing about it. They're his. Make sense? Now you remember in chapter 13, the beast also has a mark. And he's got people set aside for him to do his work. Right? So there's a contrast here. All right? Because he always has a counterfeit for whatever God's trying to do. He's trying to do his own version of it, right? Verse 2, "And I heard a voice from heaven like the roar of many waters and like the sound of loud thunder." And remember, all the way, everything we studied so far, every time there's thunder, there's voices. It sounds like thunder or roaring water. So he's hearing loud voices right now. He says, "The voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps." You ever wonder why people think there are harps being played in heaven? It comes from this. Okay, now personally, I think that's symbolic for electric guitars, but that's just me. You don't have to take my view. Like I say on all this, you can have your own view. You can have a harp if you want it. I think harps are boring, but maybe in heaven they're awesome. I don't know. And they were singing a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and before the elders. Now, where are the four living creatures and the elders and the throne? That's in heaven. So this Mount Zion he's seeing, that's his word for the throne of God. So they're around the throne. So these people have died, and they are now in the presence of God. Okay? And no one could learn that song, which is kind of a bummer, except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. Okay, so they're up there. John is seeing them with the Lamb now around the throne, and they're singing a new song. Now, where this comes from, in case you're wondering, what's this thing about a new song? A Jewish reader of this who knows his Old Testament knows what he's getting at here. You remember back when the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, well, the Reed Sea, more accurately, and they get on the other side. This is Exodus 15. What does Moses do? He sings a new song. They've been delivered, saved. That's what saved means, deliverance. They've been delivered from their enemies, rescued and delivered from an evil nation. They've come through the sea, and Moses says, this is a good time to write a song. And it's a pretty good song. You can go read it in Exodus 15. All right? This happens several times in the Old Testament. When God does something new, they sing a new song. Okay? So these people, this 144,000, They've been rescued from judgment, from what's going on with evil nations, and now they've been saved, meaning they are now in the presence of God. What a great time to sing a new song, right? Now you're probably thinking, well, what was the song? Well, I don't know, because it says we're not allowed to learn that one yet. You have to die to learn the song, I guess. Okay, that was funny to me, but not to you. Okay, so nobody can learn that song except them, and they've been redeemed from the earth. Now, I love this word redeemed in the New Testament. It means to buy back or to be purchased back. Something has been lost and you bought it back. We were lost. He bought us back. And what did he pay to buy us back? The life of his son, the lamb who was slain, right? This is good stuff, good theology here. They've been redeemed. Okay? Verse 4. It is these, the 144,000, who have not defiled themselves with women. Okay, this is a weird passage. I'll just tell you up front. For they are virgins. All 144,000 of them? Do you think that might be a symbol? Possibly not literal? Okay, we'll get there. It is these who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They followed Jesus wherever he goes. Remember, these were the Jewish people who believed in Jesus. They're protected from the judgment that was coming on wicked Jerusalem, right? So they're followers of the Lamb. And these have been redeemed from mankind as first fruits for God and the Lamb, and in their mouth no lie was found, for they are blameless. A lot to unpack here. Okay, let's deal with the weird one first. What's this thing about them being virgins? Well, we should take this, I think, as a symbol, just like it was in the Old Testament. Okay, so I'm not pulling this, not making this up. We're not changing the rules because we're in Revelation. That's very important. You don't do that. You don't change your interpretation rules just because you're reading Revelation. If you go back to the Old Testament, you'll find out that Jerusalem, or the people of Israel, are referred to multiple times as the virgin daughter of Zion. Zion being God's throne. Who created Israel? Yeah, okay. Who's the creator? That'd be God. I'm not asking trick questions here, okay? God started Israel. He did it through Abraham and Sarah. Could they have started Israel on their own? No, they couldn't have kids, remember? Right? So it's a miraculous thing that Israel ever existed. Anyway, so the source of Israel is the throne of God, Zion, Mount Zion, so to speak. So he calls these people in the Old Testament multiple times a virgin. And it's just it's a ancient symbol, and it's about purity and all that kind of stuff. Okay, Jeremiah 18:13, Israel's called a virgin. So the 144,000, as we've already learned, is the faithful Israelites, the people who followed the Messiah. They followed the Lamb wherever he goes. All right, so they're referred to as this pure group. Now, in your Old Testament, there is a very famous metaphor. We'll talk about it more in just a minute. This idea of defiling oneself. Israel is, even though it's called a virgin a lot, it's also called a whore a lot. Actually, God calls the Israelites prostitutes and whores more than he calls them a virgin in the Old Testament. Because they started out good, and then the story's pretty bad most of the time, right? Now, why does he call them that? Well, because remember on Mount Sinai, there was a covenant made between God and Israel. And remember how I've been describing that as like God got married to his people? They're like his bride, and he's like their husband. And then he comes off the mountain, and they move in together in the tabernacle, right? He moves in with his people. So he saw that as like, this is like a covenant of marriage between us, okay? So when they start going after other gods and worshiping other gods, God sees it as they're cheating on him with other gods. So he starts calling them things like whores and prostitutes. Very strong language, but it's very, if you go read your Old Testament all the way through, it comes up again and again and again and again. And the reason why is because they're faithful for a little while and then they're unfaithful for a lot of while. And it's back and forth. That's your Old Testament story. Okay? So these people who are faithful followers of Jesus, faithful Israelites, they're pure. They haven't been sleeping around on God. They hadn't been worshiping other gods or following a beast or whatever. Okay, now, so that covers that. Now, then it says they're first fruits. And this has a long Old Testament thing too. Remember in the Old Testament, the first fruits were holy to the Lord, right? Sometimes we call that a tithe. You know, they would take the first of their herds or the first fruits of their harvest, and it was holy to the Lord. That meant it belonged to the Lord, which means it don't belong to you, right? If it belongs to him, it doesn't belong to us. So that's where the Old Testament context of first fruits come from. But when we get in the New Testament, that term is used a little bit. It's got the same kind of concept behind it, but it's not about stuff. It's about people. People become first fruits to God. So just like it is in this passage, these people are first fruits for God. Now, if you look that up, first fruits in the New Testament, almost every time, at least every time I could find, it's always talking about resurrection. Jesus is called the first fruit of the resurrection because he was the first one to be raised to a glorified body, right? Now you're thinking, wait, what about Lazarus? He was raised from the dead, wasn't he? Lazarus, remember? Okay. Did he have a glorified body when he came out of the grave? No, they unwrapped him, and guess what? Guess what Lazarus got to do? He got to die twice. That sucks, right? I mean, you know, he was doing just fine, and then Lazarus come forth, and he's got to hobble out of the grave, and they unwrap him, and then right after that, it tells us the Jews were so mad at Jesus because he raised Lazarus that they were trying to figure out a way to kill Lazarus. Poor guy. You know, he can't even go around bragging about his resurrection because they'll chop his head off. Like he's going to get killed twice, you know. Anyway, so he's the first resurrection you read about, but he doesn't have a glorified body, but Jesus does. Okay? So he's the first fruit. Now, what's in a fruit? It's in the middle of a fruit. Seed, yes. Okay? And then what does that seed make? Okay, eventually more fruit, right? First fruits. So Jesus was the first fruit of the resurrection. And what did he do? He planted more seeds. Here we are, right? And one day, we're going to be resurrected, right? So these people, since they're faithful followers of Jesus, and many of them were the first people to ever follow Jesus, they're protected from this judgment time, and they will be the first fruits of the resurrection. Now, we're going to dig into this much deeper when we get to the actual resurrection passage in Revelation chapter 20. So we'll go into this a lot more detail. I'm just giving you I'm planting seeds for it. See what I did there? That's convenient, wasn't it? So we'll get to that a little more as we go along. But God's people, even in the New Testament, are referred to as the first fruits for God, right? Those who first followed Jesus are the first fruits. And this is all connected. All right, now, what about this blameless thing? Does this mean that this 144,000 faithful followers of Jesus never sinned? No. When you're standing in the presence of God, you are now sinless. That doesn't mean you are always sinless, but you will be when you get there. Amen? Good news, right? So when we meet him face to face, we don't have to worry about sin anymore. That's part of what makes being in his presence so awesome, right? So these people, they are now blameless. Guess what? In God's eyes, you're already that way. You have been declared righteous, right? So these are all good pictures for us to get. All right, so that handles that one. I know I'm moving fast. We'll have time for Q&A. It's only 7:07, so there's a good chance we'll have plenty of time. We'll see. No promises. Okay, interlude 6 is the messages of the three angels. Now this one's a little complicated. It's not too hard, but you have to pay attention to some of John's clues. Remember I told you in chapter 1 he gives you all these clues of how to read the book and stuff. So I'm gonna kind of show you how to do that in this passage, because if not, it just looks like random material. Okay, here we go, verse 6. Then I saw another angel flying directly overhead. Now don't look at my notes, look at me. Do you remember a time in Revelation where John saw something flying directly overhead? You probably don't, but an eagle flying directly overhead saying, "Woe, woe, woe," to the inhabitants of earth? Yeah? Okay. Then you get here and you read that same phrase, flying directly overhead. And if you learn how to pay attention to literary things going on, that should have alerted you, where have I heard that before? And it makes you want to go back to where he saw the eagle flying over, and he gives you three woes. And we learn you're supposed to pay attention to the woes as you keep reading, because he counts them for you. He said he'll go through, after he tells you about the eagle thing, and he starts telling you about the, I think it's the sixth trumpet, and all these horrible things go on. And then he'll just throw in there, the first woe has passed, the second one is soon to come. And he describes some more stuff, and then he'll say, the second woe has passed, the third is soon to come. So it tells you, I'm supposed to be paying attention to this. Then you get here and you see some of that same language, something flying directly overhead. But now it's not an eagle, which the eagle represents Rome, right? Now it's America. We should probably be worried about that. But now it's an angel. So this sounds better, right? So the angel's flying directly overhead, and I'm going to show you the woes and the three messages together. I'll do it for you. Now the first one, he has an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who dwell on earth, to every nation and tribe and language and people. So he's talking about there's going to be a gospel spreading everywhere. It's not just about Jerusalem and Israel anymore. We're going everywhere with this thing, okay? And he said with a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth and the sea and the springs of water." And by the way, all of these places he just mentioned, he's just spent a lot of time describing horrible things that happened in these places. Things going on in the heavens, things were happening on the land, blood in the sea, and the springs of water turned to blood, like all those judgments we read about. They sound a lot like the plagues on Egypt, right? So anyway, what he's saying here is there's an eternal gospel that needs to go everywhere. So make sure you're worshiping God, spreading this gospel. It's all about the spreading of the gospel. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, if you compare that with the woes, it connects to the third one. So what you have to do, I'm making this sound complicated. Here, I'll show you what I'm doing here. Okay, here's the three woes we read about earlier in Revelation. If you flip them upside down, they match these three. So it's kind of like the angels are reversing what the eagle said, because now they're in a different order. Biblical authors do this with their literary devices, and the way that they're doing it communicates stuff to ancient people. So when the earlier readers of this, the first readers, they noticed this and they said, "Oh, if we flip these, oh, the angel's reversing." That's how they would have understood. That's how they read literature. Okay, their literary devices communicated as much as what the words themselves communicated. Remember, I've taught you about how they do that with like chiasms, where they take parts of the story and it kind of goes down to a center. Sermon on the Mount's that way. So John's doing some of this stuff in here. So the third woe is about the kingdom, that the kingdom has come and Jesus has begun to reign. Okay, so the kingdom is here. Yes? Remember our study of Matthew? Jesus is walking around, the kingdom's here, the kingdom's here, the kingdom's here. Before Jesus, John the Baptist was doing that. Prepare the way for the kingdom. The king's here. And then he shows up to get baptized, and he's like, there he is. That's him. And then Jesus goes around doing the same thing. The kingdom is here. If you see me doing these things, the kingdom is here. Right? Okay, so the kingdom is not something way off in the future we're waiting on. The kingdom's already here. It's been here since Jesus was here. Yes? And it's going to progressively grow and all the way to the point of the new creation. It's awesome. So this one's about the kingdom. This is about the gospel. What does that communicate to us? Spreading the gospel is spreading the kingdom. That's what it is. When we spread the gospel, we are spreading the kingdom. The more people accept the gospel, the more kingdom people we have. Yes? All right? Okay? Let's look at the second angel. Another angel, a second, followed. Okay, so you saw one angel go by with an eternal gospel, right? He sees a second one following that one. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has made all nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. If I'm John, I'd be like, well, that first angel was cool. That one, though, the second one, it's not good news. But actually, it is good news because it's fallen. This evil place that has been corrupting the world is fallen. So if you go to compare that to the second woe, it's about the holy city that will be trampled for 3.5 years, 42 months. Okay, so could it be that Jerusalem, the holy city, is being called Babylon in Revelation? Well, here's what we know from chapter 11. It tells us explicitly that Jerusalem is symbolically called Sodom and Egypt. So here's what we learn from that. Jerusalem can be symbolically called by another evil nation's name. Okay? And we're going to cover this in detail next week because you're going to go read about Babylon the Great and the great prostitute. And so we're going to read chapter 17 next week, and we're going to learn more about whether Jerusalem is being referred to as Babylon or not. Okay, so where do we go here? Okay, look at the third one. We'll come back to that, all right? So just hang on to your questions there. Another angel, a third, followed them, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and its image and receives the mark on his forehead or his hand, he also will drink the wine of God's wrath. Now hang on to that. Drink the wine of God's wrath. What is wine made from? Grapes. Just hang on to that. That will make sense in a minute. And by the way, this wine of God's wrath has been poured full strength. So this is strong wine into the cup of his anger, and he will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. That's what the third angel said. He's not done yet either. There's another slide to this. So this third angel is given a warning. He's saying, don't worship the beast. We read about the beast last week, right? Don't worship this evil person and empire, and don't receive the mark, so to speak. Don't follow and do what he says. Don't bow down to his image, his statue. Like, don't do that, because if you join with the beast, you're going to end up like the beast. Okay? You're going to experience God's wrath, and you'll be tormented with fire and sulfur. Anybody want to guess what that sounds like? Tormented with fire and sulfur? Is there a fiery place prepared for some evil spirits? Yeah, we call it hell. That's our English word, right? There's several words in the scripture, but okay. So this third message is a warning not to worship the beast. The first woe talked about worship of demons and idols. So these are connected. Okay, so you kind of see what's going on here. These are definitely connected to the three woes, but they're like a reversal of some kind. They've been flipped around. So here's what the angels say. There's an eternal gospel that's going to go everywhere. Fallen is Babylon. Whoever that is, we'll clarify that in coming weeks. And don't worship the beast. Spread the gospel, worship God, don't worship the beast. That's the messages of the angels. Because the beast and the place, Babylon, whatever that refers to, is fallen. It's going down. Okay? Now this next part, and this is still the third angel talking. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night, these worshipers of the beast and its image, and whoever received the mark of its name. Remember, we learned last week the mark was the name, and the name adds up to the number, right? We talked about that last week. Go back and watch the video for that. Now, we need to be careful with this verse, and I almost decided not to talk about this, but we might as well. We need to be careful with this language, okay? This often is the proof text, and what I mean by proof text is we've got an idea and we go find a verse or two that fits our idea, right? That's what proof texting is. That's not how you want to read the Bible. You don't want to be cherry picking stuff. So what I'll just say about this, and we'll probably have a study all on this subject at some point, the subject of hell and what is it and what is it like there and how, who goes there and how long. We'll do that later. But I'll just kind of preface that study with this. We should not take this language and apply it to every single person who doesn't believe the gospel. Because this is specifically talking about the people in that time who worshiped the beast. And we learned last week the beast was Nero. Okay, and now, like I said, there's always going to be some kind of beast, right? There's always going to be evil leaders, evil nations, evil technologies. There's always going to be, the devil is always trying the same crap over and over again. He just changes the names and faces to trick us. But so stuff like this is going to continue to happen until the end, until he's defeated. But this specifically is about those people who bowed down and worshiped the beast who was working for the dragon, who we know is Satan, right, in Revelation. So we should be careful about taking that and applying that to every single person. Now, what I'm not saying right now, I probably shouldn't even have brought this up, but what I'm saying is there's a hot place for people who not only reject the gospel, but they decide to work for Satan. In other words, they decide to actively work against God and his people. You follow the beast, this is the kind of future you have to look forward to. Because we're going to read later that the beast and the false prophet, which we'll describe in a later session, are both thrown into a lake of fire. Okay? So we'll just talk about that as we get there. But what this means is the people who follow the beast and worship the beast and are killing the saints, the lake of fire is your future. That's where the beast goes, and since you follow the beast, you'll get to follow him there. Make sense? Okay? But I don't want us to take this and assume, because this looks like eternal conscious torment, doesn't it? People are going to be burning forever, and they'll know it. And they'll feel it forever. That's what it sounds like, but it says the smoke of their torment goes up. Doesn't necessarily mean everybody who ever rejected the gospel is going to burn forever. Like I said, we're going to have a future time where we can debate and figure that out. So just be careful with this. Remember, you're dealing with apocalyptic literature. Just be careful with this. Specifically talking about the people who worship the beast. All right. Then he says, here's a call for the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. So what he's saying here, these three messages, basically the total message of it is go spread the gospel and endure. Endurance of the saints in Revelation usually means stick with Jesus even if they kill you for it. That's endurance. You persevere, right? Make sense? Okay. All right, and then we get this random beatitude in the middle of it. Remember I told you in the first session there's 7 beatitudes? Beatitudes means it's a blessing. Blessed is something or someone. Then I heard a voice from heaven saying, write this. So I heard a voice say, hey, John, make sure to write this down. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit. Hey, guess what? That's the first time the Spirit talked in this book. And he doesn't do that often in this book. Just, you say, what does that mean? Well, I don't know. I'm just telling you. It's just interesting to me. I pay attention to stuff like that, right? Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit, and the Spirit goes on to say that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow him. Now, we just read about some people who get no rest, right? They followed the beast. They're not going to get any rest. But the people who die in the Lord, they will enter rest, right? And the author of Hebrews takes this concept and talks about the eternal Sabbath rest of the people of God. He's talking about our eternity. So this is the second of the 7 Beatitudes, so we'll get to more of them as we keep going. But blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Now, we won't spend much time on this, but we just might as well talk about it. If all of Revelation is about our future, which the popular books written on Revelation tend to teach, that it's all about our future, okay? Then does that mean that this verse is not true now? Let's just think about that logically. If what we've been reading in Revelation is only about the future, then that means this verse is not true right now. But as I've been teaching you, this book is not entirely about the future. It's about things in the past and things that are and things that will be after this, right? There are some things in Revelation that are coming in our future. There are things in Revelation that happened in our past, and there are things in Revelation that describe what's going on right now, right? This would be one of them. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Now, if that's not true yet, we need to rethink how we do funerals, right? Because we quote things like this at funerals. You know why? Because this is true right now. It's not true way off in the future. It's true right now. Yes? If you die as a follower of Jesus, you are blessed because you move on to rest. You go get to be with him, right? To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, right? So blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. That's true now. It's been true for 2,000 years. Amen? Good. All right, let's hit this last one. This is a difficult one, and we'll see how far we get. Verse 14. Now, before we even dig into this, let me lay this out for us. There are 2 passages in Revelation that seem to describe some type of harvest. Okay? There's 2. One is here in 14. We're about to read it. There's another one in 19, chapter 19. Now, both of these have similarities. There are some things that sound similar, but they're most likely describing 2 different events. So we're about to read about a harvest now in 14. When we get to chapter 19, we're going to read about another one, and that's the one that I argue has definitely not happened yet, the one in chapter 19. Okay? So there are 2 harvest-type passages, and I think there are 2 different events. Okay? So we're going to walk through this one, and we'll get to that one when we get to chapter 19. And then before we dig into this, the reason why I call it the harvest of the land is because in Revelation, in our English Bibles, where it says earth, the Greek word there simply means land. It doesn't mean whole globe. The Greek word cosmos refers to the whole world. Okay. The Greek word ge, which is spelled Ge, means land. It just means a region of land. Another word is called the oikumene, which means a big region of land, like an empire, the whole land of an empire. Okay. In Revelation, it's always talking about land and empire. There's really only one place, I think it's only once, that the word cosmos is used in the Greek text in Revelation, and it's talking about how Jesus is king of the whole cosmos. Everything else is talking about this regional area. So when we read this passage, we need to be thinking about a region of land, not the whole world. Does that help? Okay, now let's dig in and see what it says. Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and seated on the cloud is one like a son of man. We've heard that language before, hadn't we? Right? It comes from Daniel 7. That's the first time a prophet sees this vision of a human one, a son of man, who's coming with the clouds, and he's presented to the Ancient of Days, which is the Father on the throne. Has nothing to do with him coming to earth in that passage. He's being presented and given an everlasting kingdom. That's in Daniel chapter 7. Okay, so Daniel saw that event was going to happen. That event happened at the ascension when Jesus ascended back and sat down at the right hand of the Father. Yes? Okay. So this is some of that same imagery. There's a white cloud, and seated on the clouds one like a son of man, with a golden crown on his head. So if you got a golden crown on your head, that means you are a king and priest, high priest. Yes? Remember high priest had a crown? Okay, anyway. And he had a sharp sickle in his hand. Well, that changes the image, doesn't it? Y'all know what a sickle is, right? It's a big blade. And another angel came out of the temple. So we've got one, he's kind of like an angel, but he looks like a human. He's got a crown on his head and a sickle. And then there's another angel that came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud. Okay, so just try to picture this as we read it. You've got one being that looks like a son of man, and he's a king priest, and he's about ready to harvest something. Another angel comes out of the heavenly temple, calling with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, the Son of Man, and he says, "Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, for the harvest of the land is fully ripe." Okay? So he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle across the land, and the land was reaped. I know it says earth there. I'm translating the Greek literally here. So he's going to harvest the land. Okay? So we've got two heavenly beings. One of them's a son of man, another one's an angel. Now, you need to understand, there's going to be 4 heavenly beings described here. One of them's a son of man, the other 3 are angels. If you go back to Matthew 13, when Jesus tells the parable of the weeds, remember that? He talks about this, he creates this imaginary story to teach a lesson. He says, there was this farmer, and they went out and sowed seed, and then he went to bed, and then overnight weeds came up, right? And they went and asked the owner of the house, "What happened? I thought we planted good seed." "Well, yeah, an enemy came and planted weeds during the night. We planted wheat, and he came along and planted marijuana during the night. I don't know why he did this, but he did it, And I'm trying to lighten this up. That's all. And then they said, "Well, do you want us to pull the weeds?" Right? And what does the master of the house say? No, you're going to damage the good crop. If you go around pulling weeds, you're going to damage my children, my good crop. Keep that in mind when you get ready to pull a weed. You might damage the good crop while you're trying to do that, so careful. And what he tells the servants in the parable, don't mess with that. Let them both grow until the time of the harvest, and then we'll sort it out. And then the disciples come to him and they go, "You want to explain that parable to us, Jesus? That was weird." So he explains that one. He does it very few times, but he explains it, and he says, This is a parable about the end of the age. And he talked about the reapers, the people who are working the field, are angels who are going to be sent out from the four winds of heaven, meaning the four directions, and they're going to reap. And in that passage, he describes that the evil ones are the ones removed out of the kingdom. Okay? So just keep that in mind. We're about to read about a son of man and three angels. So there's four reapers. Just like Jesus said there would be angels from the four winds who come and reap for the harvest. Okay? Verse 17, then another angel came out of the temple. That's the third one. And he too had a sharp sickle. So this is teamwork harvest. And another angel came out from the altar. Remember there was an altar that John saw in heaven, right? The angel who has authority over the fire, because that's what happens on altars is fire. And he called with a loud voice to the one who had a sharp sickle and said, put in your sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the land, for its grapes are ripe. Now we just read about wine and how God's got a cup full of angry, strong wine, right? Now there's a grape harvest. What do you have to do before you make wine? You have to go get grapes, right? Now, at first glance, you're like, oh, yay, he's about to go get the good grapes, right? Until you keep reading. So the angel swung his sickle across the earth and gathered the grape harvest of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. Oh, this is a harvest where the evil grapes are removed. The evil grapes are gathered and makes a big cup of angry wine. It's Angry Orchard. Sorry, I just thought of that. I know I shouldn't know what that is, but anyway. What's being gathered here is not God's people. It's the evil ones who are going to be thrown into the winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city. Now, if you don't know what a winepress is, I don't know if you ever made wine, don't raise your hand. But you would, in that day, you would lay them out. You can see this if you watch the Chosen show, this show. Peter's wife in one scene is standing on top of a bunch of grapes. She's smushing them with her feet, right? And then it runs down this little thing, and they put it in vats, and they let it swell in wine skins. You know, Jesus told a parable about that too, which is a great parable, by the way. So this is going to be done outside the city, and the blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for 1,600 stadia. This is not the harvest of God's people. This is the removal of the wicked people of the land. Okay? That's who's being gathered. And your homework, I told you, if you did it, probably didn't, to figure out who's being gathered in this passage. Well, who did we just learn was gathered? The wicked people who are referred to as grapes, but they're grapes that are going to be made into angry wine. Okay? Now, this thing about outside the city. Now, if you remember, I hope you can remember this because I've talked about it enough. Outside the walls of Jerusalem, there's a big valley. There's two valleys that meet up, that go around the southernmost part of the city. On one side, you had the Kidron Valley. On the other side, you had the Valley of Hinnom. Gehenna, right? This word most often in most translations gets translated hell. Gehenna, okay? It should not be translated that way. It should just be translated Gehenna. Gehenna was a literal place. That's what they called it, Gehinnom. And it was the place where you would throw your dead bodies. It's a place where you would burn trash and dead animals or dead criminals. So this was literally outside the city wall. So what's going on here is this harvest of the land is exactly what we read about in history, because that's where most of the dead bodies were burned after the war in Jerusalem. They were thrown into Gehenna. Gehenna was also the place in the Old Testament where Israel burned their children to the god Molech. They burned their babies at an idol for Molech in the valley of Hinnom, which is Gehenna. Okay, so this harvest of the land, now this is my view. You don't have to take it. This harvest of the land is not the global harvest that we're going to read about later that involves all the nations. This one happens, and the result of it gets piled up outside the city. That sounds pretty localized, doesn't it? And then this 1600 stadia, you're probably wondering, what does that mean? Well, 1600 stadia translates to about 184 miles. Okay, it's not an exact conversion, but approximately 184 miles. So I wondered, because every number is significant in this book, so I wondered, 184 miles. I wondered what the area of the Jewish war in the first century, but how much area, if you were to go from the southernmost part to the northernmost part, so a little bit south of Jerusalem, and go to the north of the Sea of Galilee, because that's where we know Rome started the war and worked their way down, all the way down to Jerusalem and a little bit south because the southern villages were showing up to fight. And I measured that out on Google Earth, and it's about 180 to 190 miles. So now, you're probably thinking, you really want us to think that there was blood all the way up to a horse's bridle for 184 miles. No, I don't want you to think that's literal. I want you to think that that's a symbol, that's a way of saying there was a lot of blood. And there was a lot of blood all over the place for 184 miles. And if you would have been riding a horse through the land of Israel during that war, you would have read this and went, yeah, that's pretty much what it looked like. There were bodies stacked everywhere. Thousands of people were lying dead all throughout the villages of Israel. You can go read about it. Okay? So so how do we understand the harvest? Well, like I said, there seems to be two passages like this in Revelation. One's in chapter 14, which I think is talking about the judgment, the harvest of the land. Okay? The region of land around Jerusalem, Israel. Revelation 19 is the final harvest of all nations at the return of Christ. So we got a preview of what happened in Israel, of what's going to happen to all nations in the end. Okay? So just because I'm saying that what happened in chapter 14 is connected to something that already happened in history does not mean that it's not going to happen again. Because in chapter 19 it tells us Jesus is going to show up on a white horse. All the nations are going to be gathered against the saints. And guess what Jesus is going to do? He's going to make some wine too. He's going to destroy the nations who have turned themselves against him. So there's another harvest coming in our future, and it'll involve everybody. Make sense? Okay? And that happens when he shows back up. And if that sounds like bad news to you, just remember John's going to end this book by saying, "Come quickly, Lord Jesus." You feel that way? Me too. Come on. It's getting crazier by the minute down here. You can come at any time, right? Okay, I told you to do some homework. Everybody unload your guns before we get to this question. Where is the rapture in Revelation? So if you're familiar with the rapture idea, it's the teaching that is probably the most popular teaching in the West, not popular at all in the East. But over here, there's a teaching that most of us were probably taught, that the church, God's people, will be raptured out before the 7-year tribulation, and we're hanging out in heaven until the 7 years are over, and then we come back. That's the rapture of the church. Anybody find that in Revelation? Now let me, before we go any further, let me just help you think through this question. Here's some important observation. The saints, that's God's people, right? People who follow Jesus, have trusted in Jesus. The saints are present on earth for the entire book of Revelation. They're in chapter 5, 8, 11, 13, 14, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. So Revelation never describes a rapture of the saints. It's not in there. However, it does describe the saints being resurrected when Christ returns. That's in chapter 20. That's after the final battle that I already described to you, where Jesus is going to kick Satan's butt and all the nations who are following him. He's going to destroy Satan. Satan's going to get thrown into the lake of fire. And we're going to have a resurrection, and then judgment, and then new creation. Okay? So there's no rapture of the church in Revelation. You're not going to find it. Now, you might twist something and try to make it say that, but then you got to explain why there's still saints through the whole book. Right? They're still here the whole time. So if you're asking me the question, well, do you believe in the rapture? I have to ask follow-up questions like, what do you mean by rapture? Because I do believe we will be caught up. Okay? I don't know if I put the passage in here. I'll answer that in a second. There is a passage in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 where the Apostle Paul talks about being caught up together to meet the Lord in the air. Not in heaven, in the air, because he's on his way down. We're caught up together to meet him on his way down. And he explicitly is saying we are going to be resurrected and caught up together to meet him in the air as he's coming down. The Greek says he's on his way down. We meet him as he's coming. Okay? So, I do believe in the rapture. I believe it occurs at the resurrection. We are caught up, given new bodies as he's coming down, and we usher in the new creation. So there is a rapture in the scripture. The English word rapture isn't in your Bible anywhere, but the caught up part is. But it's only in that one passage, and it's about being resurrected. That probably leads to this question. Well, then what's this rapture deal that we're going to be taken out? The modern view of the church being raptured before a 7-year tribulation. And this is just the facts. I take no joy in telling you this. That idea was made up in 1830 by John Darby. Nobody had ever heard of that in church history until 1830. He made it up. And he got a small following. It took him a while because nobody believed him for a long time. And he got a small group of people called the Brethren together. And they ended up splitting because they started disagreeing with him about things. So then he gets on a boat and he comes over to America and he starts spreading it here. And that's how it got popular in the West. Okay? But nobody for 1,800 years of church history had ever heard of this idea of we're going to get raptured out and there'll be 7 years of tribulation and then we come back. That was made up in 1830. Now, first time I found that out, it angered me. And then I asked the first time I found this out was years ago, and I asked quite a few people about it, and it's like nobody knew this information. But all of my Bible college professors knew it because they know church history, and most of us don't. So I actually went back to find out for sure. Now, as y'all know, I've been studying early church history for a couple years now, about 3 years now, and I've been reading all their writings, and I've been trying to find what John Darby came up with, and I have not found it yet in any early church writings. Everybody thought we are raptured at the second coming when we're resurrected. That's for 1,800 years of church history, and since 1830 on, this idea became popular. So if you ask me, my view of the rapture, I don't agree with John Darby. Okay? I agree with Paul and John and Jesus, who didn't ever say this. What they said is we'll be resurrected and caught up at that time to meet the Lord in the air. Okay? I just said all that part. All right, let me give you the homework and we'll do Q&A. Next week we're going to read Revelation chapter 17. You're going to read about a great prostitute. That's be so exciting, right? And her name is Babylon the Great. Okay, so what I want you to do is go find out who's the great prostitute in the Old Testament. Kind of already should know that after tonight. But I want you to go read this passage. Now, this passage is hard to read because it's rough. Ezekiel chapter 16. Go read that and figure out who specifically is Ezekiel talking about. He's going to talk about a great prostitute, and all this is very harsh language, very harsh language. He's calling them, and this is what God is saying through Ezekiel. He's not just calling them a prostitute, he's calling them a cheap prostitute. Matter of fact, he says, most people pay for a prostitute, but you pay people for you to be able to prostitute with them. It's like reverse prostitute. Like they're that bad. So anyway, it's a rough passage. We go read Ezekiel 16 and figure out who's he talking about. It'll be very clear to you. It tells you in the first few verses. All right? So this is not like secret Bible code stuff you have to figure out. He tells you right in the passage. And then when you get back to Revelation 17, I want you to read and pay close attention. What kind of garments, what outfit is the prostitute wearing? And where have you heard about that kind of outfit in the Old Testament before? So just slow down and read close and think, who in the Old Testament was wearing a garment like this? Okay? What group of people wore garments like this? All right, so that's your homework. You must do the homework. Okay? It's not that hard. Chapter 17 is not that long. And chapter 16 is a little bit long. So, start on Monday and take it in chunks. It's rough. But we'll come back here and discuss Revelation 17 next week.